attendance and people will join us. It is my pleasure to introduce our first of the spring semester papers, and by So-Yoon Park, who is a research master of philosophy in metaphysics and philosophy of culture at the Katholische Universität Leuven, place I like very much actually. Leuven, there's a good Spinoza center there, and actually Aquinas as well, in Avicenna anyway, so definitely strong in history. And her current research master's thesis is Malebranche on Love of Order, and she has previously done work in philosophy and government at the London School of Economics. She's got a bachelor's in economics with Carnegie Mellon. She then has a Bachelor of Art in Philosophy from Katholische Universität Leuven, and is currently a, as I say, a research master. The paper she's presenting, I mean, in one sense, we can say that it slightly predates what we take to be modern, but nonetheless, I mean, Suarez is so important for a certain shift philosophically to modernity that I think it's a good beginning for our spring session. The paper she's presenting is Suarezian Physics and Natural Necessity. So without much ado, let's welcome So-Yoon.
Thank you. I want to thank organizers and everyone joined here today. It's a work in progress, so I would really appreciate your thoughts and questions. And the handout is just mostly a textual evidence that I used, but I do not refer to it directly except for maybe one or two quotes. So you don't have to read it now. Maybe refer to a diagram that I included. It might be helpful to follow for the section on physics. Okay. So the Shen in Physiologia describes Descartes and his contemporaries' natural philosophy project as the beginning of secularized physics and the end of metaphysical physics. Indeed, many medieval and second scholastic philosophers, even with their varying definitions of what metaphysics and physics are, assumed the continuity between the two fields of studies. Perhaps the fact that there were perennial negotiations around the two theoretical spaces speak to the difficulty of giving a satisfying justification for the continuity of the two fields. In this regard, Francisco Suarez is an interesting figure from the 16th century as he separates the two studies. Even if he will not sever the tie between the metaphysics and physics completely. He thought that metaphysical physics so far collapsed the complexity of causation, material constitution of a composite, and the natural order. But physics explains from phenomena to principles, effects to causes. The metaphysics does the opposite, the principles to phenomena, or causes to effects. Nonetheless, Suarez thinks that the metaphysical notions are always implicated in our understanding of order found in natural things. But we see that there are things that cannot be explained purely with the metaphysical principles. So a sort of strange overdetermination found in physics. In my presentation, I'm going to argue that Suarezian notion of natural necessity is introduced to amend this overdetermination. After explaining what it is and where it comes from, I will briefly discuss how this notion changes in Descartes and Malebranche. Furthermore, the natural necessity squares well with Suarez's interpretation of theological issues. But before I deal with his approach to physics and problems that arise from this theoretical structure proposed by Suarez, I start with the foundational idea from Suarezian metaphysics. The key tenet here in play is the actual essence and actual existence are identical. This doesn't just apply to God, it also applies for creatures. Let's look at the two terms of the equations first. So the definition of the essence. Essence, in short, is an individual nature. For material things, their whole ratio, nature, would be matter and form together as a whole, belonging to each things, constituted under some particular genus and species. Essence signifies its relation to being, and nature, on the other hand, signifies the operational dimension. The essence and nature of the same entity X are distinct only conceptually, a matter of underscoring one aspect over another. The essence is at the same time the foundation of negation for the thing that has essence. This negation is its indivisibility, the individual unity and consequently singularity, because numerically one individual in some species is follows from an effect of its individuality, is formally completed by the negation of division or communication. So if I cut my finger, my individuality is not communicated to my finger, but becomes a part separated from the whole. And my nature is not communicable to other similar entities, like other human beings. Consequently, I entertain the status of being a this from the and the nature we commonly understand as a abstracted from individuals, or he would say prescinded from the actual existence of individuals, are then posterior to the real individuals that ground the possibility of such conception to begin with. Now, moving on to the second term, existence. So existential being is what renders some entity formally and immediately constituted outside its causes. It is in virtue of this existential being an entity in question ceases to be nothing and starts to be something. Formally here does not mean that it is this is a formal cause, but rather just like the formal cause, this existential being is what the entity depends on primarily in a metaphysical sense. For instance, even though the proper principle of individuation for a composite substance like human being would be entity of its constituents, this form and this matter bound by this mode of unity. This form formally individuates this person because the body of a person changes throughout their lives through continuous nutrition. But still by the primary dependence of the composite on this form, this Paul continues to be the same Paul. Or you can consider an identical twin. Peter and Paul are distinct only by their souls, even as they are born in the bodies that are just numerically distinct. For God, the existential being would come from himself, thus exe, which makes him the actual entity. And for all the others, the existential being comes from another. So it has actual entity through the causation of another. And in fact, whether an entity exists in itself, i.e. subsistence, or in another, i.e. inherence, is established only after this intrinsic existential being of this entity is established, after the question of its source is settled. In that sense, subsistence and inherence are modes or ways of being. Suarez judges that any other kinds of distinct conception of being is redundant because this existential being sufficiently explains how one, new and temporal entity comes about, 2, agent's action can be terminated. 3, ground the real relation and real dependence on an efficient cause. Right, moving on to how they essence and existence are distinguished. So from the previous part, we can conclude that this existential being that formally constitutes the essence of a creature in its essential actuality. The identity between the actual existence and actual essence is real in every way. Neither existence nor essence can be understood as something separated from each other. One of his short argument goes as follows. If there is essence without existence, that would mean that essential predicate of X, which would be somehow really distinct separate entity from X, can intrinsically constitute the X essentially. But obviously he finds this argument implausible. For Suarez, essence without existence or essence in potency could only be comprehended as an objective potency, i.e. a mere logical possibility, or in its non-repugnance, that is, non-contradiction of the creatable. Then the question is, how can we prescind the existence from essence without a logical contradiction if the essence and existence are actually identical? Of course, Suarez rejects the real or modal distinction between essence and existence, but he does accept that they can be distinguished by reason with some basis in reality. Unlike God, a creature lacks the necessity to be what it is, so it must always rely on the influence of another. This indicates an imperfection that characterizes the creature or finite beings. By contrast, being in act belongs to the actual God, but also in every true objective concept of God. Then what he is implying here is that the difference between the true objective concept of essence based on proper negative abstraction must be distinguished from the objective concept from precision. To cut up a whole in different ways to analyze parts is an intellectual operation natural to human mind, but this also opens up a space for an error. As an example, Suarez talks about human beings' essence qua abstract, men, can be predicable of individuals because it preserves the existence, essence, real identity. But essence qua precise, humanity, is not predicable to either Peter or Paul because this idea from precision is inadequate in some way. And maybe we can talk more about this later. So let's see what this actual identity implies. Again, real essence is formally constituted by the existential being. This equation was already indicated by the definition of essence. An individual nature, since unity and being are convertible terms. But it was just a matter of how we should understand this being. This entity, when conceived under the term essence, highlights a thing's constitution within the realm of real being belonging to some grade or order of beings explained with genus, species, etc. But this same entity, when conceived as existence, it is a being in natural things and outside its cause. If God is the only necessary actual entity and all other entities lack this quality, once this being is communicated to creatures by efficient causality, it would get the formal character of being outside its causes. And the same would be the case for the subsequent material generations of the creature. We'll come back to this point. A few implications can be noted from essence, existence, real, actual identity. One, if some philosophers, namely Thomists, believe that there is some real essence separated from existence. And if that means that there is a separate thing called a common nature that relates to individuals as superior to inferior, Suarez would actually say that a common nature, in fact, secures its conceptual unity based on the similarity found in the individuality of things, since insofar as it can be understood as having some real essential negation, the concept presumed negation is borrowed from the individuals. So the conceptual unity of the common nature is only a derivation found from the mental concept that we can have about natural things. And this is why for Suarez, distinction concerns only entities and excludes concepts, since you can only distinguish two things by what constitutes them into the being they are. 2, given that essence is an individual nature, we can draw that only singular things exist essentially. The extension of individuality for Suarez spans from all the way top with God, who actually has the individual unity par excellence, to a level down to a simple spiritual substance like angels, rational souls, to composite substance a level below, material beings, including human beings, and even down to a simple incomplete substance, forms, matter, modes, accidents. Suarez insists that for Aristotelian physics to work, the principles of natural things must be singular entities themselves, because only singular entities can be the terms of causal relations, whether they are involved as a causal agent or as another that terminates that causation. So the operational dimension of an entity is ensured by its own being. Suarez's essence existence, real identity, is getting at the same distinction it claimed by Aquinas as the act of being, actus essendi, and actual activity, actus operandi. Existence is primary perfection of being, which underlies potencies that are actualized through the second perfection. And perfection being the translation of first and second entelechy is found in Aristotle's De Anima. Suarez explicitly calls his versions entitative actuality as the first actuality and the operational actuality as the second. So the entitative act is opposed to the objective potency, while the operational act is opposed to the subject potency. In this way, I'm convinced that even as he is explicitly disagreeing with the essence, existence, real distinction, and all the logical consequences spelled out in the Thomist metaphysics, Suarez sees himself as aligned with the spirit of Aquinas and Aristotle, perhaps amending the details in the system to better articulate their thoughts. You can see in that Suarez directly takes on the burden of proof by going to Aristotle himself. Aristotle claims that whether it is existence and what it is essence are distinct questions. For Aquinas, this claim supported his real distinction position, but Suarez's rebuttal is that whether it is can be understood in two ways. One, whether it actually exists, or whether it is true real being, which could be. And the latter way of reading that question would be asking the same question as what it is. Okay, so moving on to physics. Let's see how metaphysical principles actually interact in his physics. So if we accept this thesis that essence and existence are really identical, Does that mean that matter can exist without any relation to form? It's odd, but Suarez's answer is yes. God can without contradicting himself qua creator of nature. But to understand how Suarez accounts for these supernatural events, how he accounts for the natural order should be understood first. If primary matter and form can exist as separate entities, what ensures that a composite substance actually comes to be? In the ordinary course of nature, we never experience form without matter and vice versa. So here you can refer to the diagram I attached. So to summarize briefly of how a composite comes to be, according to Suarez, primary matter always exists with some disposition left over from the previous corruption, which acts as a preparatory accident for the composite that will come to be. Suarez gives a general description of disposition as what exhibits order and thus an orientation to an end. That includes spatiotemporal, habits of the soul, passive quality of the body, etc. And disposition plays an outsized role in Suarezian physics. Deschênes, for instance, argues that Suarezian accidents can be effectively divided into two categories: dispositions that precede form and powers that follow it. So like we saw, since he holds that matter has some ontological heft in it by itself and can act as a quasi-subject for accidents, we don't need to posit something like a corporeal form to account for vestigial figures that remain corpses as proposed by Duns Scotus. Then, matter depends on accidental forms to exist actually in nature, which is the case especially for quantity. In case of a human being, it's a special case. God creates a rational soul, and from the potency of the soul and matter together, a motor union, another individual entity distinct ex naturale, is educed. They together constitute a complete human being. While the rational soul can subsist without matter, it cannot be completed and perfected without its body, through which its vital operations can be actualized. On the other hand, matter is the proper material cause for all other substantial forms. When matter is properly disposed, an appropriate form is educed, and the mode of union is co-educed from the potency of the matter. To be more precise, a separate finite agent effectively produces form in matter, and matter receives this form and sustains its being in nature. So matter and finite agents depend on each other to produce a composite. In this manner, matter sustains forms as a proper subject, without which the matter cannot exercise its material causality as a constituent. When a necessary disposition is lost in that matter, matter would not be able to sustain its reception of form anymore, in which case this form would perish and the whole composite would be corrupted. Sometimes by accident, it might happen that the matter remains without a new form because there might not have been an agent nearby, or maybe there was an agent that removes the necessary disposition needed for such and such a form that it was semi-disposed to. Still, this matter would bit by bit become disposed to receive another form in lieu of the previous form it was impeded from receiving. So it might be a temporary condition. In short, Suarez is willing to accept that not every corruption is immediately followed by another generation. What this means then is that the kind of dependence form has on the matter is a priori, while the matter upon form a posteriori. Against the Thomist position, matter depends on a form not as a true cause, but only as a concomitant condition demanded by natural necessity for its actual existence. Form is not an intrinsic cause constituting the being of matter, but relates to the matter extrinsically by way of terminus, since essence of matter consists in an aptitude for form. Whether it is with or without the real form, such aptitude would remain. This aptitude explains why matter is transcendentally related, habitu transcendentalis, to form. To be more precise, habitude generally is not a relation yet, but an inner feature that something has, inner feature of something that orders it towards something else. So a hawk can have an habitude to hunt a rabbit and a rabbit to be hunted from a hawk, and not as a merely logical or semantic correlate, but as real habitude. But the relation between the two cannot be actual until the two relata, hawk and rabbit, are actual. But the transcendental relation links the metaphysical principles without presuming their actual relation. So the correlate concept that we are more interested here is the physical habitude. The physical habitude links specifically this matter with such and such a form, this position with this form. The physical habitude or relation, Suarez explains, is an accidental or only negative determination that does not relate to the being of the matter, i.e., it's the entitative act that maintains the transcendental habitude. Okay. I hope from this description, you can also discover that Suarez's physical description seems a bit overdetermined for what is and what can be provided from his metaphysical principles. He has to rely on the natural necessity as a notion to explain the order and degrees of determinacy found in physics. Natural necessity has been used before Suarez, usually to validate their inductive reasoning, as in the works by Scotus. It meant inherent laws in the natural nature of created essences, and it is not applicable to God's power, which in turn is limited only by logical and metaphysical necessity. Suarez accords with this general characterization, but I will argue that he goes a step further by giving us how natural necessity could be justified in phenomena. Quoting Suarez, it is probable in physical things that which occurs always occurs in the same way and never another is naturally necessary. So we never find nature, we find in nature matter without form or without accidents like quantity. And this necessity is founded upon the intrinsic need of matter. He further elaborates elsewhere that, quote, for every being which is imperfect and incomplete in its order, like how form and matter are incomplete substances, can depend on another being, either as on an intrinsic cause or as on an extrinsic cause, insofar as it is otherwise consonant with that imperfection of such a being. End of quote. On the face of it, the last statement is nothing that interesting. Accidents, for example, rely on the subject to exist naturally. But what is implied, though, by these two statements together is that it is the need and the imperfection of, say, matter, the most base thing in nature, that actually provides the force for dynamism found in nature. So aptitude of aptitude of matter for form, for instance, is a positive spin on the term potency, power. It is the power that befits this partial being, since it is matter's very partiality that drives itself to a union with form and further subsequent perfections. So it would be a mistake to understand so-called pure potency to mean that matter is absolutely deprived of an act, since matter is always an entitative act through which it can be granted a kind of quasi-subsistence, and thus it can be guaranteed as an ultimate and the first subject that sustains all various forms. So matter lays a physical foundation, in short, for all individual substances, and the primary foundation of negation proper to individuality of future substances, as it is the first subject among the physical principles. Suarez also mentions and rejects other misinterpretation of the notion natural necessity. In fact, Suarez is quite critical of what I call a top-down approach that establishes a very general principle and tries to explain more granular parts later. One of the imaginary opponents invokes this kind of top-down natural necessity, or the order of the natural universe, but says it arises from the fact that there is some universal agent that is always ready to supply matter with form after corruption. This is very interesting position since it edges closer to the Cartesian picture. Suarez calls this proper need of the matter of foundation for the institution of nature. And its need is how the primary matter can be preserved naturally and perpetually, and remains always ready to be with the form by slowly amassing necessary dispositions. And this is how really independent entities of form and extended matter come to be united together. Of course, later on, this term institution of nature gets taken up by Descartes and Malebranche, who were no doubt familiar with Suarez's work, as they were both directly quote Suarez's work. In Descartes' philosophy, the institution of nature becomes a code for God himself, who establishes the transition between the motion in mechanistic body and sensation or thoughts possible. To understand a thought as a modification of an extension and vice versa is to make a categorical mistake. And in Malebranche's adaptation of the term, the institution of nature gains a more explicitly theological tint. The institution of nature establishes a connection between the perception of bodily modification, with the soul being directly modified with pleasure or pain, and the connection between one's willing of the moving of his body with the actual movement through general laws. So Malebranche seems to come back to the older description of the lawfulness in nature. When the condition of X is met, God always acts in the created things as he is the only real cause. God personally connects what is naturally separate. Furthermore, in addition to our knowing and moving, Malebranche in his later career adds that through the institution of nature, we can be animated by the continuous impression of God's love for himself. So there is a drive or inclination in my soul to love good and avoid bad will. The necessity observed in nature then is from the general laws established by God. It is called general, not eternal, because creation involves finite beings, thus always arbitrary in relation to what is eternal. Nonetheless, it is always the efficacious necessity found in nature. I think these modifications of the term institution of nature might be considered a reply to Suarez from later rationalists, because once we leave the Aristotelian construct and understand the constitution of nature through res cogitans, res extensa, the need of the matter or body in itself cannot compel the other substance. Neither are partial or incomplete anymore. So some other concept in turn needs to be introduced and fill that role. For Malebranche, that would be occasionalism. So since natural necessity is a physical notion, it cannot be derived from a metaphysical principles. It must rely on observations and probabilities, because sometimes we cannot really experience involved metaphysical principles. Substantial form, for instance, are experienced only through its effects, and often, just like in the case of a corpse, there is no immediate effect that shows that a new form has been introduced after one soul has perished. So he seems to be fine with leaving natural necessity without a satisfying demonstration. Still, some certainty, as in known by natural reason and made certain by faith, often evoked by scholastic thinkers, can also be lent to Suarezian physics, because it accords rather well with his readings of some theological doctrines. It must be noted that the way he uses religious doctrines is not meant to be some theological deus ex machina or completely unique outlier outside of the order of the nature. In fact, Suarez repeats over and over that God's power is limited without reason. Religious doctrines are supposed to actually illuminate the metaphysical construct of the physical natural world. For instance, Eucharistic miracle shows that God can conserve an accident of bread and wine without a subject. So this would have to mean that a material substantial form can also be conserved without matter, because the accident's dependence on subject is greater than the latter, since accidents are less actual than a substantial form. What this miracle shows is that insofar as the constituents, individual form and matter of a composite have extrinsic relation to one another, God can supply this extrinsic cause immediately rather than relying on the secondary causes like he usually does. So without the intervention of God, it would be the case that matter and form will always be together as limited by some particular disposition following the natural necessity. And that even if God's action were supernatural, the produced term must be natural. So that whenever he intervenes with created affairs, his action would not be repugnant. That is, it would not contradict his earlier actions. So his actions are constrained only by logical and metaphysical necessities. For instance, in case of a resurrection through a supernatural action, a rational soul could be transmigrated from one matter to another, but the resultant composite would be form and matter subsisting naturally. To understand creatio continua as conceived by Suarez, we need to go back to the physical description of generation and corruption of a complete substance I canvassed earlier. Like we've already seen, the natural agent's eduction process through which a complete composite comes to be presupposes prime matter as real being. And this applies to God as well. prime matter and rational soul are created ex nihilo. Two are both ingenerable and incorruptible substances. The act of creating cosmos ex nihilo thus primarily concerns matter. Then, by a separate action, God informs the matter with matter of generable things. Two actions are essentially distinct because they have different formal and total terminus. Because of the being of the matter that is conserved after creation is entirely the same being, that same matter, and same matter that was the end of the creating act. So Suarez holds that the very act by which God creates matter is identical with his conservation of the matter. Furthermore, Suarez indicates that even the first informing action of God, properly conceived, is not a creation. God's informing a priori depends on a presupposed matter. Thus, even for the first production of the form of earth, as in God created heaven and earth, Suarez insists on the term eduction. He is showing us that there is an analogy between God and natural finite agents' eduction of form. In his own words, if the word eduction only signifies the positive nature of that action by which form comes to be independence in both its coming to be and its being upon a matter, which is not created by that action, but is presupposed as created, it is really eduction. Likewise, the subsequent informing either by educed forms, material forms, or created rational forms, human souls, presuppose the same conserved matter. From Suarez's perspective, there is no point in trying to safeguard the supernatural uniqueness of the creation of the world. Instead, the genesis of the cosmos is an informative and unique case that we can learn from to know more about the natural world. And it can correct our wrong theories. Okay, to summarize, essence that we define as individual nature is formally constituted by true existential being, meaning that it is something amongst the natural things outside its causes. From this essence existence identity in reality, we saw that they are only distinct rationally, which is related to the finitude of the creative beings and that receive being from another. And furthermore, Suarez concludes that only singular things really exist, essentially from which, and furthermore, Suarez concludes that only singular things really exist, essentially from which an intellect can draw a concept, while he can be read as a really original thinker in proposing this thesis. I don't think he would really like that label. Which is why he labors to forge connections to earlier authoritative thinkers, whether it is Aquinas, Aristotle, or Scotus. And while the metaphysical principles being real entities ground the possibility for physics, in Suarez's physical analysis, a kind of overdetermination arises, which Suarez seems to justify with natural necessity that gains force from the imperfection and the need of matter. We also briefly discussed how the term institution of nature will be adapted in Cartesian philosophy, and why Suarezian version has to be modified given the dualism found in the new philosophy. The proper and continual being of matter is also secured by his interpretation of continued creation. As long as God continues the action by which he created matter, the basis of generation and corruption can be assured. Then, as far as introduced other basic parts, i.e. partial entities either created by God, or it is from the potency of matter by natural agents, we get a glimpse of more complex network that can expand upwardly in diversity. At the same time, this diversity in phenomena is multiplied by God's supernatural interventions that do not remove the rules of natural interactions between basic parts. Helena Top says that reading Suarez requires 3 eyes, one for those who precede Suarez, one for Suarez's words, and one for those who follow Suarez in the history of philosophy. Well, I hope you found something interesting, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And what I suggest, what probably the easiest thing to do, if people just posted a chat that they will have a question, this would be easier for us to follow in terms of order, in terms of whom I can see. So who wishes to raise the first question? I'll try to not do that. Okay, Andrew.
Okay, I might be very much off base, so if I am, please just set me right. But first, thank you. I learned a lot from this presentation on Suarez, and I've been thinking a bit about actually the concept of creation in Suarez, especially as it relates to generation and corruption, because I think that might be the one place where I think I might disagree with the linking with, Thomas, Suarez, and Aristotle, because for Aristotle at least, and I think also kind of in Maimonides, you've got this idea that it's exactly and precisely the idea of generation that comes from corruption, and then the turnover and something like that. And I think it possibly relates to Suarez's belief in creationism as more than just a dialectical thesis. And that's more of how I see it, at least in Aquinas and Maimonides, where it's set down as like a more than likely it's this way. And I guess I kind of distinguish that from what we see in like Averroes and Aristotle, for example, where it's more like the world was just eternal, that there wasn't like a creation, even if it wasn't in time. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but do you think that Suarez and his delinking, I guess, of generation and corruption is related to the creationist aspect, or is it something even deeper that I'm not seeing?
I don't, let me know if I misunderstood your question, but I don't think he delinks generation and corruption from creation, but rather creation is, I think the way he thinks about it is not like kind of existentially like voila, like here's the thing, but rather I'm creating a condition for a being, condition of possibility for the beings to be generated and corrupted. So that's why I think he doesn't like delink it, but rather he is giving terms for a all the terms needed for a natural generation and corruption. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And now we have Friedrich Wilhelm. You have a question?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this talk. It was very interesting. I would be curious to get better to know if you see a correlation and if which between causa efficiens and natural necessity. Because causa efficiens we had in one point only as God's intervention. And do you see a correlation between the two? Thank you.
Well, I haven't yet read his disputation on efficient causality. But I think the efficient causality and natural order relates with the idea of concurrence, the implicit I don't know, like it's an okay sign that is given by God at every moment of generation and corruption and the interaction between the physical principles. But I have to admit, this like idea of concurrence is something that I have to investigate further. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
We'll get back to efficient causality later. Okay, Paul?
Thank you.
You had called me, yeah.
Oh, I see a hand there.
Yeah, okay. I go by Richard. Okay.
Oh, you go by Richard. Okay, that I didn't know. Okay.
No problem. Only I wasn't sure whether you actually meant me. Okay. My question is, given the large, the three eyes you were using, I wonder, would you suggest then that Suarez is in a way preparing or paving the way to identifying nature and God, making nature coextensive with what in theology is called God? Because from what you said about the reception in Descartes and Malebranche, it sounded to me like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. God is nature. I think that will, I don't know. I often feel uncomfortable with reading Suarez as someone, like for instance, like Helen Hattap describes him as a tragic figure that paves all the way to the modern thinkers like Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, etc. But he does that without, I don't know, without meaning to. But I have a kind of different picture of Suarez, because he is, in his mind, I think he's correcting Aristotelianism and getting rid of all the Platonic and Neoplatonic elements in the Catholic philosophy, because in the fifth disputation, for instance, he goes directly at Plato. He doesn't, but he also has to deal with limiting Aristotelian philosophy with Catholic doctrine. But going back to, with that in mind, going back to nature, God, identity, I think he would say that the distinction that you have to pay attention to is that order of nature is driven by the imperfection of matter. So that imperfection is radically distinct from the perfection within God, right? God is like completely perfect being. So the dynamics of God versus dynamics of the nature is driven by something completely different. In fact, essentially what characterizes both of them.
Thank you. Okay, there's no other question. Okay, Emma.
Unless I'm cutting you off, Edith.
No, okay. Let me. I want two quick follow-up questions. One, there's a really important distinction in Thomas that will help you, that you never mentioned here, the difference between esse tantum and esse commune. I mean, there's some excellent work actually by Father Owen on the difference between which shows you a certain kind of perspectival relationship without reducing one to the other. But and one of the things there that could be helpful in responding to Andrew's question is that in many ways, not just in Thomas, but elsewhere, you've got in one sense two orders of creation. Okay? Creation, and then the question of temporality. Like normally we talk about creation in time. There is no such thing as creation in time. There's creation and there's time. Okay. Okay. And at that point, once you get there, you already have the distinction between we're not at that moment at the level of a materia prima, okay, but of protohule, we are already at the level of determinate matter. But the point is that Aquinas makes quite an interesting distinction that helps him between non-ens and non-esse. In other words, the relation between form and matter is a relation of they don't exist per se, but only in composition. Once we are at second order. And at that point, you can really give a more robust account. Do you find any of that in Suarez?
I don't really know Aquinas.
No, he knows Aquinas very well.
Well, I don't know Aquinas that well.
Okay.
But that's interesting. If you could send me some of those works, I would like to kind of read it over and think about it. But for now, I'm kind of drawing blank.
Okay. Because that would, I think it would help your argument. The other question that I think should be on the table in some way or another is what's the status of analogy?
Right.
Because really in Thomas, what we have is, we don't have an analogy of being, we have an analogy of predication. And that is much closer, okay, to really equivocation. It's not equivocation, but closer to equivocation. And Elizabeth Ashworth has done fantastic work on that. But by the time we get to Suarez, we're getting to a fourfold analogy. It is an analogy of being, which changes the picture quite a lot.
These are all very interesting suggestions for kind of expanding this work. I would love to get your email and some book names and stuff.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, Emma, you had it.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the talk. It was very close to a lot of the problems I've been thinking about in correlation to Suarez. Now, I have one specific curiosity, I think, which is, so, I mean, I was just rereading, like literally, as a side to your talk, I was just rereading the account of distinctions that Suarez gives us, right? The seventh meditation. And seven disputations, sorry. I've been teaching too much Descartes. So what I'm trying to get at is, how can he create a barrier that avoids for him to have to, so basically by his own account, you cannot have anything else but a real distinction between two things that can be separated, right? And if you want to say that the form of this body can be separated from it, as I think he should be committed to, right? As a Catholic who believes in the afterlife. So what I'm asking is, can he safeguard a way in which the essential form is still eternal, without, because for example, like we know that other people struggled with this, right? Whenever they try to use the notion of soul as form, it's really messy when you get into that. So is his notion of form radically incomparable with that of soul? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. And this goes back to like where we talked about what we talked about in physics,
Exactly.
and that there are two ways of informing matter. One concerns material forms, where it's educed from the potency of the matter. But in case of a soul, it is created by God. It has nothing to do with the natural generation. So
Right.
that's why he can keep, I think that's how he can say like rational soul is eternal. Like you don't, it can be, it can be perfected as like a human being. And that's why he thinks, you know, the perfection of a composite is more perfect than perfection of a form.
Mhm.
So,
Right. So I think like, so this is exactly what I wanted to ask, because at that point, I see him walking directly in the trap of Plato, right? End of the Neoplatonics. So if he does think that, if he thinks like, okay, so there is the form of the body, but that is not what the soul is, and the soul has its own independent generation, which is direct creation, then the form of the body dies with the body, right?
no, there's no form of the body, corporeal form in his idea. Rather, he's saying there are dispositions
Okay.
that keeps the figure of me in my corpse. So there are accidents that stick to my matter, even as my rational soul departs from my body. So rather you go towards the extended matter picture.
Yes. So I'm saying that doesn't sound very Aristotelian. That's what I wanted to push him. So as you're saying, he's trying to restore Aristotelianism, or at least that's his general standard that he's that he wants to flag. That does not sound like something Aristotle would be okay with.
I think what he's trying to safeguard here instead is the that there needs to be only one form in a composite. You cannot have like what Scholastic is implying is that there are multiple forms in a single composite. Like you said, after my soul departs, there remains a corporeal form, but that would mean you would have to have more than one form that is informing a same human being. And I think that's why he is more willing to accept, matter is always extended. Matter is always with the accidental form, because accepting the other hypothesis, the corporeal form is for him unacceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And also thank you for walking in the den of modern philosophy experts, because like you're walking right in the mouth of the wolf with Suarez, but it's a lot of fun, and so thank you.
Yeah.
There's no other. Can I do a follow-up here in terms of form, matter, and form in terms of soul? One distinction to be made, and we do find it in Thomas actually, because to account on on the soul being eternal a parte post, not a parte ante, and that's it, that the soul, the reason, okay, the soul is the form of the human, okay, intellect, okay, is a form of the soul. So what is it? No, is intellect, okay, not, okay, which takes us to Spinoza as well, but intellect is really the form, what is really eternal rather than the soul itself or reason, etc. Reason is discursive. Reason is definitely material in that sense. Intellect is not.
Right.
it would be like nous, because by the time we get to Descartes, what we have is an inversion of the relation. Well, Descartes is still struggling, but an inversion of the relation between reason and intellect. Reason becomes higher than intellect, but until we get to Descartes, intellect is really what is sempiternal.
Could you explain more? What I think I couldn't hear you when you mentioned the Descartes reversal.
Yeah, what we have, by the time we get to Descartes, I mean, he's having a lot of problems, but we get to the point where we start to have the reversal between reason and intellect. Up until we get to the 17th century, intellect is the highest perfection. And in that sense, intellect is what is unchanging, what is eternal. In that sense, you can't have it, it's not individual in many ways. Okay. In other words, we don't disagree about parallel lines. Okay. I mean, there's a whole contraveroistas controversy, but the whole point is that it is, and the question here, where Suarez would stand, if you really want, I mean, the two orders, then reason indeed would be lower than intellect, would be the form of the soul, and in that sense, not the form of the human being. Soul is body, intellect the form of the soul, and in that sense, intellect is that which is eternal a parte post, not a parte ante, but a parte post.
I'm just kind of curious, as we go through the, go past Aquinas's position. I don't really know the theological history all that well, but how well, how much of that position was accepted, like to prioritize intellect over this, like the whole of the soul, seems for me like kind of counterintuitive from for a Catholic to accept, I'm just kind of curious whether this more staunch Aristotelian version of Aquinas sticks around after him. I don't really know.
It's not Aristotelian, it's Aquinas. I can give you Thomas. He's sitting there. Okay. I mean, that's key.
No, I sorry. I don't mean to interrupt. I just, because I can see what the question is. The question is, there clearly is, once you start thinking in these terms, since intellect, as we know, is a matter of participation and cannot be individual, and that's what brings Spinoza to his problems as well. I think that the question that Soyun is asking is, how can it be, can become orthodox and an interpretation of what really matters about the soul, the form of the soul, in which that, it's the problem of medieval philosophy, if you will, the problem of the active intellect. Once you make it non-personal, how can you make it the soul, right? Because we want individual immortality. So I think that, am I stating this correctly, Soyun?
Yeah, I was more in that light. We're, for instance, it's a very kind of simple example, but you don't pray to the intellect of your deceased grandparents, but you pray for the deceased soul of your grandparent, something as intuitive like that.
Anyway, I'll interrupt us here because I see a question from Larry and then another question from Richard. So Larry, you go first.
Yes, I enjoyed the presentation very much. I wanted to ask you to go back over, I'm looking at it from a Spinoza perspective and his
Mhm.
concerns about breaking the laws of nature and the supernatural being a question that he put forth. And so I'd like you to pick, you can pick any miracle you want, but in your paper, if you could just review that discussion, because I appreciated it, but I don't think I got it. So
Right.
where you talked about how Suarez would interpret miracles and
Mhm.
still keep a naturalistic structure. I enjoyed that very much. Thank you.
So I think the way he deals with God and miracles is actually quite close to what Malebranche does, meaning that we're moving away from an omnipotent God, but intellectual God. So God is for a God to act, he must always be consistent. So if he makes a miracle happen, he has to make it consistent with everything that exists and that he has brought to existence beforehand. Here, so let me see. So Eucharist miracle is actually, I don't know if I want to take that up. It's a it's a tricky business. But for instance, let's say,
How about just bringing Lazarus back or something simple like that?
right. So if
you know, water to wine or something like that.
Mhm. So if there is a resurrection of Christ, and actually I haven't really thought about that one, but well, when
Yeah, use a simple, was used any simple. I think
Yeah.
you used one during your talk and I missed it. I can't remember it, but something
But-
from your talk, just review.
Right, okay. Then what he's saying is that when he is limiting Aristotelianism with the Christian doctrine, is something like a Eucharist miracle, where we accept the fact that accidental forms can be without its subject, the matter underlying and supporting that form. So for him, because accidental form relies on the matter more so than a rational soul is dependent on the body, it must be the case that God can also preserve, just as he can preserve the accidental form, he can more easily, even more easily, preserve the rational soul without its body. And then if we were to bring it back to the body of, bring it back to the resurrection picture, then the soul will be with the body that is properly disposed, and it will continue to subsist as a natural thing without having God sustain that, or like make that thing unnaturally sustained, subsisting, and so on. I don't know if that makes sense.
Rich?
To the last thing you said, it makes a lot of sense, because that is, of course, connected, or was at the core of the debate about the immortality of the soul that was booming in the 15th, 16th century. And so key people are Massimo Ficino, Pomponazzi, Contarini, and so on. And the point was indeed to somehow get the intellect out of the other parts of the soul, the traditional parts of the soul, so that the other traditional parts of the soul, the sensitive and vegetative, can die happily as long as the intellect survives, and then returns, as you said. So, and just to mention that Descartes' Meditations was intended as a contribution to that discussion about the immortality of the individual soul. Yeah. So from that point of view, it is in the middle of what you're doing here, and that's very interesting. I'm very glad about that. My question, however, was a different one, and that is, you spoke about the induction of the forms out of matter, and I just wanted to mention yet another heresy, and that would be that all forms emerge from matter, and that was, for instance, Giordano Bruno's interpretation of Aristotle. And Suarez certainly had that present, even if he didn't read Giordano Bruno, he certainly knew about this danger. Bruno refers to David de Dinant. So how does Suarez avoid the heresy that all the forms pop up out of matter and consequently don't need a creator God?
Right. I think just by making the rational soul an exceptional case, he somehow wiggles out of that heresy of Dinant. Yeah, it's interesting. I cracked open his meditation, not meditation, disputation on creation, but I haven't really gotten into it. But in the beginning, he talks about the creation and the subsequent generation as passive emanation, which is very weird for me because he is obviously trying to get rid of the Platonic elements, but regardless uses that eminence emanation language. This is something I have to kind of think about and read more about.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Andrew?
Andrew, yeah.
Maybe my question will make more sense after Richard's. I mean, it's not like a restatement, but I guess then in light of the discussion where God takes a more, like the philosopher's God is what we're dealing with here. But also like Ficino and Giordano Bruno, two opposite poles of the spectrum. But I guess I'm confused now about what exactly the role that faith plays in Suarez's physics, where you mentioned, right, like religious doctrines such as transubstantiation in the Eucharist aren't supposed to be Deus ex machina, right? But at the same time, I guess I'm then confused on how they can illuminate the natural world while also returning to an Aristotelian conception, which just doesn't really leave room for things like miracles. I mean, without even looking forward to Spinoza or any kind of critique like that. So I bought the point you made earlier in response to me, where creation wasn't like unique, it's like a supernatural event, but rather God placed the kind of conditions that would spur about creation. I guess I'm still just confused on what role faith would then play regarding religious doctrine, if they're religious doctrines, if they're not effectively Deus ex machina.
Well, it's not Deus ex machina, and I think this is the thrust of my argument, is that material world accords with his theological doctrines, in that if God continuously sustains the creating act of matter, he is continuing to he's continuously creating the condition of lack for the matter, from which the generation and corruption and all the other perfection, like subsequent perfections, are possible. And this is why physics for Suarez emphasizes the natural necessity that doesn't need to be in the Aristotelian metaphysics. So in fact, Aristotle gives us a great metaphysical construct, principles, and physics actually tells us there's some another way to conceive the reality, and that relates to God's actions, I think. Does that help?
Yeah, I think I see someone else has their hand, but maybe I'd say something about metaphysics and Aristotle.
But I see Jeffrey Milstein, and then we have to call it quits. So, Jeffrey?
Yes, thank you very much. The notion of accident in your paper, in terms of Suarez consideration, reminds me of contemporary, or for the past 100 years, the both physicists and philosophers have talked about the notion of randomness. Einstein, who was a Spinozan, said God does not play dice with the universe. And yet the physics that has developed over the past century of quantum mechanics finds indeed that the world is guided by randomness. So I'm just wondering, did Suarez think in terms of randomness when, as you put it, accident?
So it's interesting question. It's something that I'm trying to figure out as well, that I am unsure of what the answer is. But the way he talks about disposition kind of remains obscure, in that how do you understand this a messing of the correct dispositions in the matter? How does that actually yield a concatenation of educing a form rather than staying as a mere congregate, right? Aggregate. So are we talking about just a bundle of randomly required accidents, where until the minimum condition for one eduction form, one eduction of a form is possible, or what kind of order within the aggregation of disposition leads to the actual eduction? This is something that I am still unsure about. I think he kind of leaves it ambiguous as well, if I haven't, based on what I've read from him.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think it's time for us to thank Soyun for a great paper and for a great discussion. And I look forward to seeing you in our next meeting. Bye.
Thank you.